great event. As people trickle in, I just wanted to welcome everybody and thank you all for joining. I am Dustin Loop, the Executive Director of ISOC-DC, and we're really happy about co-sponsoring this event along with the American University School of Communications and the Internet Governance Lab at American University. We have a great group of panelists for you today, and I will introduce the panelist slash moderator, Dr. Aram Sinreich, who has a foot in all of the co-sponsors of today's event. He's a counselor for ISOC-DC, a professor at the School of Communications, and a fellow at the Internet Governance Lab. And so I will hand it over to you, Aram, to introduce the topic and get us started.
Thanks so much, Dustin, and thanks to Matt and to everybody, especially Dave and Emma. Data has become central to the political process in ways that we don't yet understand. The collection, the analysis, the dissemination, disinformation has become foundational to the way that we operate as a democracy. And yet we don't really understand the scope of data collection, the scope of data analysis, and the scope of data deployment. We have little glimpses around the edges of the role that it's played in the past in our elections. We read the Mueller report, we read the Senate Intel Committee report, we read journalists like Carol Cadwalader, who have revealed all kinds of fascinating things and terrifying things for the future of democratic society about the ways in which our data are being harvested, the ways in which they're being used to shape campaigns, the ways in which we have become knowable in terrifying and new ways. And we know for a fact, especially after the Facebook and Twitter announcements that came out yesterday, that foreign governments like Russia are at it again in the 2020 US elections. That disinformation is central to the major party campaign on the right and possibly on the left at this point. That there are several foreign and unknown parties who are actively collecting and disseminating information about American voters in 2020. There was also allegations yesterday that voter rolls from a major US state were hosted on a Russian hacker server yesterday, and there was a lot of debate in political communication Twitter about how serious a problem that was, whether this is just business as usual and these are public data that everybody has access to, or whether it demonstrates that we are now entering into the October surprise phase of the 2020 elections. I am frankly terrified. As a citizen, as somebody who's been researching data for 25 years and its interaction with society, with business, with democratic processes, I now feel like we are in a world where I cannot meaningfully participate as a citizen, let alone as a scholar or as a teacher, from the basis of understanding what's going on. And that lack of knowing is something that I see in everybody that I speak to. I live in Washington, D.C. I work in Washington, D.C. The people that I associate with should theoretically be those who are the most informed about the role that data is playing in the political process. And yet everybody seems mystified, flummoxed, and uncertain about what the future holds. Now, I am very lucky in that my professional associations and friendships extend to the people who are at the leading edge of researching these subject matters. The two people who have agreed to participate in this conversation, I won't call it a debate, although I'm hoping it becomes one to a certain extent, are really possibly the two foremost political communication researchers looking at the role that data plays in the political process today. If not the two most, they're certainly among the top. And the whole reason why I wanted to organize this event was I had lunch with you guys about, what was it, 2 years ago, Emma and Dave? We were at some kind of political event in DC, or maybe an academic event, and the three of us got together for tacos. And I think the Mueller report had not yet dropped, but we had a sense of the allegations about the role of Cambridge Analytica in the 2016 elections in the US and the Brexit campaign in the UK. And I asked some kind of simple question like, you guys are smart. Can you explain this to me? Like, what the heck is going on with our data? And the two of you, two super brilliant, well-versed scholars who have delved in depth to this, came to completely polar opposite conclusions. Emma, not to preempt your comments, but you essentially came to the conclusion that everything is totally screwed. SCL and Cambridge Analytica have rooted democracy. All of the data are completely susceptible to collection, harvesting, analysis, monkey business, and democratic processes cannot function in that environment. Dave, you were, I'd say, the more kind of mediated voice. You said, well, yes, this is a change, but it's an incremental change. And as I've written about in my earlier books, data has been central to the political process, at least since the 1990s. And most of what Cambridge Analytica was selling to its campaigns, including the Trump 2016 campaign, was essentially digital snake oil, smoke and mirrors. It was a put on in order to get funding, but what they were really up to was no different than the kind of dirty tricks that you've seen in campaigns for decades, if not centuries. So what I wanted to do for you guys, for the viewers out here, was to take that conversation and bottle it and put it in the public, because like I said, I'm terrified. I don't know what's going to happen in November. I don't know what's going to happen after November. And as a researcher and a citizen and a parent and a teacher and an American, I feel like I really want to understand this as well as possible before things go completely off the rails. So without further ado, this unconventional introduction, let me more conventionally tell you who you're going to be hearing from. Dr. Emma Bryant is an associate researcher at Bard College in New York and specializes in researching propaganda. She was central in revealing Cambridge Analytica and their parent company SCL's wrongdoing in 2018 through the UK Parliament, US congressional committees, and other public inquiries, and is now writing a book, which I've read parts of and it's fantastic, on the recent digital governance crisis. The book is entitled Propaganda Machine: Inside Cambridge Analytica and the Digital Influence Industry. Dr. Dave Karp is an associate professor down the block from us at AU at the George Washington University School of Media and Public Affairs. He teaches and conducts research on strategic political communication in the digital age. He's written 2 books on digital politics, The Move On Effect and Analytic Activism, along with many articles and far too many tweets. That comes from Dave's bio, not from my editorializing. I'm a big fan of your tweets. You called Cambridge Analytica, quote, the Theranos of political data way before it was cool. And a word before I pose the introductory question to you guys and ask you each to speak for 10 minutes or so. I want everybody to know who's on this, who's viewing this live stream or who might be viewing an archive of it in the future, that this is not the bubble. We are not inside the Beltway. I mean, we are inside the Beltway, but we are not, well, 2 of us are inside the Beltway. Emma is far north of the Beltway. We're not living in some kind of fantasy land. We're not operating out of dark shadows, as people like to say. We are not agents of some kind of nefarious influence. We are scholars who are desperately interested in understanding how democracy works and how to keep it working, and what role data and new technologies play in that process. And for selflessly doing that work, the people who you're going to be hearing from today, both Dave Karp and Emma Bryant, have suffered very personal attacks from very powerful interests. Dave Karp, famously now, was the subject of an effort to get him fired by one of the most prominent newspaper columnists in America, not because he'd done anything unethical or wrong, but because he said a mildly ad hominem negative comment about that newspaper columnist, which happened to be completely accurate. And Emma Bryant is somebody who, because of her role in unmasking these nefarious events, has actually been subject to death threats and threats of personal harm. So before we continue, I just want to say to both of you, thank you. Thank you for what you do. Your scholarship is one of the safeguards of democracy, and I appreciate that. So without further ado, while we're on the subject, here's the initial prompt, and then we'll get into some conversation after that. What are the things that we, as Americans, as citizens of the globe, as human beings, should be most worried about in terms of the interaction effects between data and the political process going into the 2020 election? Why don't we kick things off with Emma, and then we'll move to Dave.
Okay, delighted. And thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I want to add to that, if I may, that both of you are amazing friends and colleagues who have supported me so much. And my Twitter battles with Dave are probably notorious at this point for the frustrated different points of view, which we're going to get into, I'm sure, a little bit today. But you know, while I was at GW, who was an amazing colleague, so supportive, and, you know, while I was going through all of these difficulties, both of you, thank you for being there, as, as academia should. But anyway, so to the problems that we worry about in 2020. You named this session Beyond Cambridge Analytica. And my first reaction to that was really, beyond? This is what we're still dealing with right now, okay? We have not moved beyond it, and I kind of wish we had. This week, I revealed the British Information Commissioner's Office. That's the organization, the public body that oversees data law in the UK, had dropped their investigation into Cambridge Analytica without telling anybody, and have actually, you know, not produced their final report, which was meant to be revealing what was on the Cambridge Analytica servers that could explain to us what exactly happened with the data that everybody has speculated over for the last, 3 years. So this, unfortunately, this crucial, report has not been released. This was going to, for instance, go into, details about like why the data might have been accessed from Russia, which came out in the inquiry. We still haven't got to the bottom of that. We don't want to be speculating about these things. We want to know. And the British government, for some reason, the regulator has, dropped the whole thing and not pursued it. And that has massive implications as well for the investigations in the United States. The recent Senate report that was produced just a week or 2 weeks maybe ago was, gave a very minimal overview of what Cambridge Analytica was doing in 2016. And, in there in small print at the bottom, it says, we were unable to get the information from the British regulators that they had, the servers that they had confiscated. So we weren't able to access Cambridge Analytica's communications. Well, they weren't able to also interview people that were crucial to this. So what exactly did they do to investigate this? I would like to know, because, talking to whistleblowers isn't enough. You actually have to go beyond, and you have to look at the data. You have to look at the servers. And why was this not shared by the British government? So I've been looking into this, and one of AU's wonderful students, Zaman Qureshi, who I'm sure is in the audience, has also been assisting in this amazing effort. I'm really impressed. He wrote to the British Parliament and has found out that the commissioner is going to be interviewed by the British Parliament soon. So hopefully we'll get a few of the answers, but I don't think this is going to be quite the reveal that we want it to be. Further, beyond the failure to address the legacy of CA, crucially, we have the building on top of what their methods were, and the advancement of this kind of data gathering machine beyond the 2016 apparatus, into a point where there's a lot that's unknown. But what we do know is that Cambridge Analytica's methods were being repurposed over the last few years to build the current Republican data gathering machine, which is I'll give you a little bit of legacy on. So the Philanthropy Roundtable and the Relationship Enrichment Initiative were two of Cambridge Analytica's clients. They got millions over the course of a couple of years. So 2 million for the Relationship Engagement Collaborative over 2 years. And this was being spent on behavioral microtargeting and the development of efforts of surveys that were enhanced by Cambridge Analytica's methodology to target people and bring them into churches. Now, that's not an issue in itself, of course. The issue is more how this has been used beyond that. So bringing people into the church, targeting actually some of the most vulnerable people in our society, people who were having relationship stress, people who were, for instance, from struggling with addiction and so forth. These people have then been, as a new film, which is coming out in just a few weeks, will reveal in all glory, it's really shocking, have been, their data has been repurposed for political targeting. It's extremely disturbing when we consider at this time, everything has been moved online. This app was developed for targeting people and bringing them into the churches. Churches which actually in American life have for a long time served a political purpose. We see that, you know, Christians have been recruited into the Republican Party in massive ways for a very, very long time through evangelical foundations and so forth, nonprofits. And actually, I want to give a shout out for this fantastic book by Ann Nelson, which goes into the history of this. But until about 2016, there wasn't this massive data-driven effort. And this is what Cambridge Analytica were essentially developing to bring people into the churches. This has been now abused, I would say, en masse. With we have seen in recent months the Trump campaign buying 80 million religious Americans' data, which has obviously come from somewhere. And if we look at the communications that this film will reveal, as well as what my upcoming book, which were, you know, which go into the heart of the Philanthropy Roundtable and these efforts to gather data, this was being repurposed for political targeting. These are people who are dragging data on people from surveys that are going into mental health. You can look at the micro-targeting categories, which seem to be, you know, enabling the targeting of people based upon mental health and addiction. Look at what's happened in the last sort of 6 months or so. We have, I'm just going to try and find the statistic. The CDC did a survey in late June and found that 40% of US adults are struggling currently with mental health or substance use. During Cambridge Analytica's development of their methodology in 2016, they were running experiments on American voters, en masse, hundreds of thousands of American voters, where they were testing fear-driven messaging against the psychographics. Now, Dave will tell you the psychographics weren't terribly effective. I also have internal documents from Cambridge Analytica that show on many levels they were not effective. They were exaggerating in the promises they were making to a lot of people. However, a lot of the research that's been done on these targeting methods isn't actually looking at what they were effective at, which is driving fear among the most vulnerable people and the people who, you know, are already neurotic and scared and fearful. Sure, it's not going to help you sell cars by using these personality clusters. But if you want to drive fear and violence, it probably would be very effective to use these kinds of targeting. I can't find my piece of paper now, but I was going to read you a quote. I think it's blown away. But they found a 20% increase in this particular category. And if you look at things like, rallying the NRA and so on, and the types of QAnon conspiracy theories that we're seeing at the moment being distributed, this kind of paranoid approach in the midst of a population who are en masse suffering with mental health difficulties and targeted at communities that are, really struggling the most, who might be seeking help from churches and community projects. This is a huge and very disturbing and very troubling eventuality. I want to highlight, before I finish, because this isn't just in my book, this is also a massive project of 3 important people. So 2 filmmakers, Kat Gelin, who's the director of an upcoming film called People You May Know, which you can see at metrotonemedia.com, the trailer for, as well as her partner, Charles Creel, and an important researcher from the from Australia, who has been digging into all of this and played a much bigger role in the film than I did as well, I should say. And that is Brent Allpress, and you should check out his Twitter. It's really illuminating on all of this. We've all been researching this for quite a long time, and the film will come out on the 28th in the United States on Amazon.
Thanks so much, Emma.
Sorry, hopefully that was like 10 minutes. I'm trying to power through.
No, that was a great job crystallizing a decade's worth of work into 10 minutes of summary, and it already led to so many questions. But I'm going to hold off and let Dave present his perspective on the subject, and then we'll get into the nitty-gritty. And I promise I will leave time for a few audience Q&As, which you can enter into the Q&A section on the Zoom interface. Take it away, Dave.
Great. First, a note on misinformation. Aaron, we had burritos. We did not have tacos. So you just
disinformation, man.
Just lying to the audience.
I had a taco.
Okay, you had tacos. Thanks for having me. It is really nice to be here in my own living room. It occurred to me if Room Raider takes a look at this, I'm going to get utterly thrashed by them, but what are you gonna do? So there's sort of 2 notes that I want to make. First, because I'm worried that I'm getting framed as the person who's not hair on fire worried. And anyone who follows my tweets or reads my stuff is like, that doesn't sound like him. I am very, very worried about the 2020 election and whether or not it will be secure, whether we will have a free and fair election. And my critiques of the micro-targeting conversation, which I think often end up getting framed as critiques of Emma, but they're not critiques of Emma. They're critiques of a broader conversation. And then since the 2 of us know each other, we end up yelling at each other on Twitter a bunch. But my critiques of it are largely because I think that the focus on micro-targeting dating back at least to 2006, and you can actually trace it back even to the 1990s, I think that focus distracts us from what I see to be much bigger areas of concern. So let me start by outlining what I am concerned about, and then I'll outline my criticisms, like why micro-targeting and the next Cambridge Analytica are just not the things that are keeping me up in sleepless nights. It's other stuff. And so the first point, I'm going to crib from a piece that I wrote for Wired. I think it was just after the 2018 election, titled "How to Hack an Election Without Touching the Machines." Because the point that I wanted to make in that was just after the election was that when we talk about hacking elections, we can mean 4 different things. And one of the things that Cambridge Analytica has become a stand-in for is like hacking the voters' brains. The idea that micro-targeted communications, be they misinformation or just really well targeted information that's psychologically digging at each person in just the right way, is going to lead voters to cast a ballot they wouldn't otherwise cast, and that's going to swing elections, and that's the thing we need to worry about. So we can call that direct opinion change. That's one way that we could say when we talk about like hacking the election or hacking people's brains, like that's one of the things that we can mean. Another thing that we can mean, sort of up the sophistication level, is hacking the media agenda. So in 2016, while Emma and I can debate how much psychographics were used and how much they were effective in directly targeting voters through Facebook, like we can go back and forth on that several rounds and still probably disagree. One thing we can't disagree on is the hacking of the media agenda, that there was a very clear, now well-documented effort using, amongst others, both Russian cutouts and WikiLeaks to hack DNC servers and release that at just the right moments so that the media would cover that instead of covering other things. That also changes what people are thinking about, and I think has a larger impact in how the course of the campaigns run. If we were to rerun 2016 without the WikiLeaks hacks, there's a key week in the middle of October where Donald Trump is melting down because of all the reveals of the Access Hollywood tape. And WikiLeaks then is released right away, changing the story. If the story had stayed on him, I think he keeps on melting down, and Republican elected officials keep on unendorsing him.
It was a couple hours, right, Dave?
What's that?
It was a couple hours.
It was, I don't know the number of hours it was, but like it was quick and coordinated. So that's a second level, is not directly hacking people's minds, but hacking the media agenda. That I think there's more evidence of, and I'm more convinced of at least the agenda setting effect there. Then one step above that is structural voter suppression. That is, and data gets used in this too, right? Like data gets used in order to analyze how do Democrats and or people of color and or young people who tend to vote Democrat vote. So in the state of North Carolina, do they tend to vote early? Do they, like, which polling places do they gather at? And then Republican elected officials and Republican operatives have weaponized that data in order to shut down specific polling places or like change what days one is allowed to vote on for early voting. When they shut down voting before Sundays, and I think it was North Carolina, they may have done it in Georgia as well, that was structural voter suppression aimed at making it harder for likely Democrats to cast ballots and people of color to cast ballots so that elected officials could select who the electorate would be. You see the same thing in states like Wisconsin and elsewhere, where they say, okay, you need a new form of ID to vote. And in order to get that, if you don't have a driver's license, you need this new form of ID. You can only get it at this one office that's open like 2 hours a week. Good luck getting there. That again is structural voter suppression, trying to make it so that it is very easy for Republican voters to vote and very difficult for Democratic voters to vote. That has an impact on elections. And I don't think we spend enough time with our hair on fire about that. I spent a lot of time really worried about that. And then the fourth, which is sort of the big terrifying thing that we don't talk about because it's so damn depressing, is actual hacking of the voting machines, which computer security experts tell us every few years, hey, these are not secure, you need to be worried. In the state of Georgia, there was a bunch of signs that we needed to be worried, and the state of Georgia decided nobody can look at this anymore, and also we're gonna make sure there's no paper trails, that if they're like, there can't be audits to find out if there was tampering. So of those four, I am most worried about actual hacking of the voting machines. That is one way to tamper with an election that we are sure would have an impact if it happened. We're not sure if it's happening, but we should be really worried and really angry when Congress doesn't approve enough funding for election security. Structural voter suppression, we should be hog wild mad about, particularly with the slicing and dicing of the Voting Rights Act, which has made it, since the Voting Rights Act was taken apart, all of the states that were previously under federal mandate to get pre-approval for any of their changes to who and how can vote have unveiled a raft of changes to make it more difficult for people of color and Democrats to vote. That should really worry us because that changes the outcome of elections. Hacking the media agenda, we should be worried about it and yelling at journalists a bunch. So that's one of the things that many of us do on Twitter plenty of times, sort of both for fun and for professional reasons.
And sometimes in person.
Yeah, and sometimes in person. And then direct opinion change is the area where I kind of find myself shrugging my shoulders. So now let me spend just like 3 minutes on why the Cambridge Analytica, like when I first heard the Cambridge Analytica stuff, I was kind of like, that doesn't line up with my understanding of how political campaigns are run, both because it seems like a difference in degree, not a difference in kind, and also because there's this overpromise, underdeliver that campaign vendors have been doing for years. So a few data points for people on this webinar to think about. First is, so first let me grant, like, yes, Cambridge Analytica got a giant pile of Facebook data. They got it in an unethical manner. Facebook did not do a good enough job trying to get them not to, though I get that, like, Facebook sent a sternly worded letter to Cambridge Analytica saying, hey, you have data you shouldn't have, you have to destroy it. That was because for years and years, Facebook was basically giving this data away. And then they were like, we're not gonna give it away anymore. Please erase it. And like, nobody did. So they sent a sternly worded lawyer letter, and like Cambridge Analytica was like, sure, we totally got rid of that. And they didn't. Like, on the one hand, Facebook didn't do a lot there. On the other hand, like, Facebook doesn't have the Facebook cops. They couldn't like send the Facebook cops to SEL and be like show us that it was deleted. So they were in a bit of a bind there because for so long they were just giving that data away, and then Cambridge Analytica just still had it and were finding ways to use it. So it's not that I don't think that they had the data, it's that I don't think that the data was particularly powerful. And so the things that I think we should keep in mind here, first is a point about how US elections are different than other elections. I visited Australia back in, what was it, June 2016, while they were running, they had just announced their election. And I visited a group called Get Up, which is like Australia's Move On. Those are a lot of the groups that I study in my books. And they had like a countdown clock on the wall because they had just started this like bruising long 30-day election. And as an American, I was like, oh, this is adorable. You think 30 days is a long election? US elections go on for what have we been in this for, over a year already? We're not even at the 1 month mark. We still got like 3 months to go. US elections are insanely long and insanely expensive, multi-billion-dollar affairs. And that isn't true in any other country. And the sheer size of the ad budgets, the sheer size of the campaign budgets creates industries with strong incentives for bullshit. Because if you get to be the ad vendor, you get to buy a new house. And if somebody else gets to be the ad vendor, then they get to buy a new house. So that creates an incentive for this over-promising and under-delivering. Cambridge Analytica, before they worked for Trump, worked for Ted Cruz. And I'm not trying to say like, oh, Ted Cruz didn't win, so they're not magic. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that when Ted Cruz's campaign fired them, Ted Cruz's campaign operatives fired them because when they looked at the job Cambridge Analytica was doing, they were saying, look, you're promising us these psychographic models, and then what we're finding is that your targeting is so far, like, you're not even delivering to the right households, basically. Like, Cambridge Analytica had all of this data. I'm convinced of that. I'm not convinced that they were using it particularly well, particularly compared to all of the other vendors who are also micro-targeting, but they weren't making claims of psychographics, because that's the new thing that's getting Cambridge Analytica the contract in this case. So I think the evidence that they were actually doing micro-targeting more sophisticated than other vendors out there is pretty weak. The other big note I would make, and I've made this in a bunch of my writing on this, is American elections are the worst possible place to have a breakthrough in the science of psychographic advertising, or really of any type of advertising. And the reason for that is if you think about just like the whole universe of advertising, right? Like what you're trying to do a few things through advertising, but mostly you're hoping for behavior change. You're hoping for people to become aware of a thing that they weren't aware of before. You're trying to get them to buy a product that they wouldn't have otherwise bought. Like a good example of something that really could have used advertising is Google Glass. Right? Google Glass came out, people knew that existed, they didn't really know much about it. So you can educate them about it, and then you can like make a case for why you would want to wear these glasses with like a headset on them. And they didn't have good advertising and it failed. That's a place where I could see really sophisticated advertising moving the needle. One of the worst places to try to use sophisticated advertising to move the needle is in convincing people who already know a lot about Democrats and Republicans, because we're in a sea of advertising and it's the same two parties throughout our lifetimes, that they should vote for a candidate that they wouldn't have otherwise voted for. It's more like Democrats versus Republicans is more like Coke versus Pepsi. We already have deeply ingrained senses of who these two companies are. But the difference here is like Coke will spend a lot of money on advertising to try to get you to buy more Cokes. We only have one vote though. So the other reason why it's a terrible place to try to innovate here is we get one vote on the first Tuesday of November. Up until that one vote, you can't actually measure whether or not your advertising is working. So like on a day-by-day, week-by-week time scale, it's not like you can roll out these psychographic models to like different segments of the populace, run tests and have an outcome variable that says like, oh, this modeling really worked well. This modeling worked slightly less well. Next week, let's try it again and see how it moves the needle on actual voting differently, because we only get one vote. So the thing that's always stood out to me, the reason why I look at Cambridge Analytica's claims about psychographics and say, look, even if you can do it in labs, like on the mass scale, like this seems like snake oil to me, is if psychographic advertising worked, we would be seeing it in the sale of gym memberships. Right? That is a place where on a week by week, like different personality profiles will be motivated to sign up for an expensive gym membership by different messages. So the same data on like your neurotic tendencies and like your entire, like your personality profile, that same data set would be really financially valuable to the gym down the street from me. And they could be advertising to me differently than my wife because we have different psychological profiles. And they could measure on a day-to-day, week-by-week basis whether their psychographic advertisements are making more money for them than anything else, because they could actually measure, okay, well, we tried these out. Did we, through this experiment, sell more gym memberships than we otherwise would have? The fact that in 2020, gyms are still not doing this is a really big red flag to me, because the claims that, oh, this works so well in getting people to vote for a Democrat that they vote for a Republican they otherwise wouldn't vote for. Well, you can only do that on election day, and that's just pardon my language, but that's a really shitty testing ground for any new experiments in advertising. So it would be strange if the one place where these psychographics worked was in elections, but not in all the other places. Now, the thing I do want to note there is that's when I'm talking about the direct impact on people's vote choice. I am much more worried about things like misinformation in areas like misinformation around COVID and health. Because while we all know a lot about what we think about a Democrat and Republican, a year ago, none of us had heard of COVID. So the lack of information amongst the mass public on COVID means that all of that misinformation, which is massive and organized, can lead to huge public health scares and can also lead to things like conspiracy theories and QAnon. I'm really worried about QAnon. I think QAnon is going to be the next, I think the next Tea Party after 2021 is basically going to be a souped up QAnon, and that's going to lead to violence. That's going to lead to death. So I am fully—
I think you're underselling it, my friend.
Yeah, so I'm like, it's not that I'm saying we don't need to worry. It's that I think we need to worry enough about so many things that I'm not particularly worried about the micro-targeting of propaganda. I think the propaganda that's most dangerous is spreading like wildfire without much targeting.
So let me jump in with a question. I know Emma wants to respond to a lot of that, and I'm going to try to form a question that allows you to do that, but also ties together some of these threads. So the micro-targeting that Emma was talking about that most alarmed her was the identification and exploitation of emotionally vulnerable people, of whom there are a heck of a lot right now because we're all living a nightmare life, even those of us who have the most comfortable lives and tenured jobs, right? There is, as you point out, Dave, a vast ecology that surrounds the voting process that ladders up to this binary choice, Coke versus Pepsi, vote versus not vote, in November, but impacts all of these different processes, from the media framing and selection of stories and agenda setting to civic participation, violent and nonviolent, to the reception and redistribution of disinformation, right? So all of these processes that surround that ultimately shape the outcome of the vote have some integral dimension of them that is reliant on the collection of information and the targeting of information, which are two, as you both point out, two very different processes. And one of the things that neither of you really mentioned much yet, although that's central to this ecology, is the role of social media, right? Both as the platform for the collection of psychographically targetable information, as Emma pointed out, and for the dissemination of disinformation and other kinds of organizational regimes, as Dave has pointed out. So I guess the question that I want to ask, and feel free to take this and run with it in whatever direction you want, is for the sake of the 2020 election, we now have a 2-month window. It's probably not likely that we're going to pass any major legislation between now and then, or even implement any kind of regulatory regime that would have a significant effect, which means that it's essentially incumbent upon private industry to self-regulate, which is part of what Twitter and Facebook were trying to make a show of yesterday. But in your ideal world, in order, let's think even beyond the 2020 election, where is the best place to intervene in terms of regulation, either industry self-regulation or legislation or executive regulation, or even international treaties and accords? So is it the data rights regime? Does America need a GDPR style regime or something stronger to prevent the collection of these data? Is there some kind of limitation on First Amendment rights that would hold the press accountable for sharing disinformation? Would it be better protection of the election infrastructure? Would it be breaking up big tech, as people on the left and the right have both threatened to do? Where can/should we as a nation intervene in order to fix what's broken ecologically and allow data to be used in a way that's more democratic and less subversive to the democratic process? Emma, why don't you go first, since Dave just spoke?
Thank you. First of all, I want to say I don't think people's brains can be hacked. I didn't choose the title of the great hack. And, you know, some of the language that this debate has been rolled up in isn't helpful for anyone to understand what's going on. I would counter a little bit by saying that the groups that I'm worried about are the ones that are being targeted with the kind of messaging that you're worried about. And while I don't think their brains can be hacked, I think that, you know, when people are fearful, when people are suffering from depression, anxiety, and so forth, they are not reviewing disinformation and information they are consuming in the same way. They are much more likely to share things and to engage with things that are more paranoid and, you know, more in line with their emotional state. And, you know, we are like all, you know, online at the moment, giving more and more and more of our data. People are engaging with these kinds of efforts because they're seeking help. So we've got this massive vulnerable community who are being targeted with the exact type of disinformation that you're worried about. So that, I think, is concerning. I absolutely accept everything else you said about, you know, the media and the, you know, one thing that really pissed me off, I'm going to use that word, about this whole thing is how abstract it has become. I didn't want to talk about microtargeting particularly today. Aaron will acknowledge. I get very fed up with the fact that we have, you know, that actually we didn't, the media focused in on this because it was geeky and exciting and new, and because it was being emphasized by Cambridge Analytica's people, including Alexander Nix, who was boasting about its use, obviously, and claiming that it could be applied and useful in all the contexts that you're talking about, selling dog food, gym membership, when actually the primary and as far as I can see, only real enhancement that it had in campaigns was for driving fear among fearful people and people with mental health issues. And so if you're wanting to sell guns, it's probably going to help. If you're wanting to elect Trump, it's probably going to help. If you're wanting to pull people into churches, it might help. Or, you know, these kinds of of repurposing of data might be helpful as well. And that's not to say this is all we need to worry about. Of course not. Oh my God, no. And that doesn't mean also that taking down loads of information off Facebook is the answer. It doesn't mean that, necessarily only the data realm is the answer. The way that these foundations are being supported, the kinds of money and politics issues, if you can't fund secretly these kinds of things, if you can't hide and make everything opaque through shell companies and so on, if we deal with campaign funding, then this would close down the realm of hiding a lot of these operations that are so disturbing. What America does need is some kind of answer in terms of data law. It should not be possible to be weaponizing things like mental health data. Of course, there are restrictions on health data already, but actually this isn't enough and it isn't working. And America needs a regulator that will actually take action and be proactive here in the way that data is being used. Also, the new legislation, I think I've been asked to comment on, that has been brought in, I think tends to, and this applies also to the GDPR as a critique, tends to focus on consent. So me giving my consent for my data to be used, or having the ability to control my data, or maybe get money from my data, sell my data, and having some control factor will necessarily solve this problem. Well, I don't think it will, because the issue is that it's how data is being used in the aggregate. And I might not really care that my data is being used by Cultural Freedom Initiative and, its new incarnation, which is Communio, to be targeting these kinds of, religious communities and so on. I might not care that my my photos are being repurposed for facial recognition technologies that are targeting Muslims in China, But and I'm giving that up. Like, I don't care. I'm putting that out there publicly. But you know what? Somebody needs to care, because the public, the public responsibility factor needs to come in here. We have to have, there has to be a duty of care. There has to be like some kind of regulation that stops public data, people declaring on social media that publicly that they have mental health conditions. This can all be harvested. You don't need to hack data even. It's all out there. And without some kind of regulator, looking at how this data is being used in campaigns, we have no response to this at the moment. It's appalling. So that does worry me, and especially within the context of voter suppression more broadly, and hacking of election machines and so on. It's a very disturbing picture when we look at the big picture of what's going on here.
Yeah. So a couple of things. One, I agree with you about fear-based messaging, but I think where I disagree is data being particularly important there. So if I think about the 2018 election in October, the October surprise then was the caravan, right? They basically invented this foreign threat of a very slow-moving caravan that wasn't anywhere near the US border, and then sent the military to the US border just for a big show. So this is again hacking the media agenda, a big show in order to focus people's minds on there is a foreign threat of non-white people, and if you like your culture, then you better protect it. All of that is meant to activate that fear that you're talking about.
Yes.
It's not particularly targeted though, right? Like that's mass. And that's also not new. Aram and I first met when we were both professors at Rutgers back in, what was that, 2010. So Aram, if you recall, in the 2010 election, the equivalent of the caravan was the Ground Zero Mosque, right? And the Ground Zero Mosque, since many of our listeners probably won't remember this, was not a mosque and was not at Ground Zero in New York City. It was a Muslim community center like a few blocks away. but nonetheless, it got amped up into this story of, oh, you know, the Obama and the Democrats, they want a mosque on ground zero, and that is a threat to your culture, and you should fear that other, so turn out to vote for Republicans.
Sure.
That, again, isn't micro-targeted, like one piece of one electoral message to one voter on Facebook and another electoral message to another on Facebook. That is, it's time for the election. We're going to amp up our voters who are afraid by activating this cultural fear. What's going to be our new hack to do it? Some version of that is, I mean, we're seeing that now, like that is the Trump messaging on Kenosha, right? Like Trump messaging on Kenosha is, if Joe Biden becomes president, then this non-white other is going to burn down your cities and your suburbs. That's nearly a direct quote from the RNC last week. And like, that's what that St. Louis couple basically said verbatim at the RNC last week. So that messaging is what we will likely see for the next 2 weeks. That is fear-based messaging. I agree with you on what it is trying to do there. But because that is happening so much at the mass scale, and because that's actually such a well-worn trope in Republican politics, I have difficulty seeing it as something that is particularly new and particularly threatening now that our data is involved in it. Because even
Is it an either or proposition though, Dave? I mean, it's possible, for instance, for the Republican Party to weaponize white anxiety about others invading their neighborhoods on a massive scale, while tailoring messages based on targetable information in a way to maximize the delivery impact of that fear.
Right, and then the question becomes, how much added value are you getting from that tailoring? And what I'm suggesting is that the difference between a world in which they're tailoring a lot and they're tailoring a little is, I think, pretty small.
It's at 77,000 votes.
When it comes to this type of person, you know, people with these issues who are being targeted with these kinds of messages, finding them and targeting them is the enhancement. It doesn't work for everything.
There's two ways to reach them. One is to have such good data that you can perfectly find, like, let's imagine that Nix was actually accurate, and they are precision targeting finding each of those people. That's one way to make sure that each of them finds it. Another is just to turn on the fire hose and hit the entire world with the same message, and that way you'll make sure that every single one of them gets it. And since we can see the fire hose, like they're spraying that message absolutely everywhere. And if that is the central message of the RNC, then targeting doesn't add on a lot of extra value, because all of those people who you wanted to reach with the message already got the mass message.
But to your point, it's not just about shaping people's opinions, it's about shaping their behaviors. Do people show up to a demonstration or not? Do they show up to vote or not? Do they participate in phone banks or not? Do they share either an accurate or a misleading article on Facebook or not? Those decisions are what ladder up to success or failure in the election, and those decisions are very micro-targetable, are they not?
They're micro-targetable, but they're not the sole thing. I mean, this is in the political science literature, what we know about the effects of both advertisements on electoral outcomes and campaigns in general on electoral outcomes are that the deltas are actually really pretty small. And again, this is the reason why I keep on going back to issues like actual hacking of voting machines, which we don't know if it's happening or not, but we should worry, and structural voter suppression, is the amount of effort that it takes in order to use an entire national campaign apparatus to get people to cast a ballot that they wouldn't have otherwise cast, or to get them to vote for a person they wouldn't otherwise vote for. That's actually a really heavy lift, particularly in the polarized country that we have today. And you see this in Donald Trump's approval ratings of the past 4 years. No matter what he does, he barely ever goes up or down, because we're pretty well cemented in our opinions. So what you can do then, the easier lift, if you want to change election outcomes, is take away people's ballot. Like the really easy lift, if the Trump campaign, and we've been seeing this and hearing about it the past few weeks, the easiest lift for the Trump campaign to change the outcome of the election is to set it up so that the Postal Service is way too slow, and everything that, like all the mail-in ballots, then don't arrive by election day. And then you just say, well, we're not going to count anything, even if it was sent a week before the election, if it didn't arrive beforehand because we were slowed down. If you feel confident that it's going to be more Democratic mail-in ballots than Republican mail-in ballots, and then you shut down the mail-in balloting, that will then radically alter the votes that get counted. And that's actually that's a much bigger impact. Like the delta there is much larger than in like a bunch of extra phone bank rounds or a bunch of extra advertisements or advertisements that are more efficiently targeted. Like because the impact of campaigns is only a few percentage points, and those percentage points do determine the entirety of power. Like the stakes are incredibly high, and it's also like a very close race. If you want to move votes, like moving votes through like a big earnest campaign or like micro-targeted disinformation is really hard to do. Moving votes by kicking out ballots, like it's unethical and it's illegal so long as the courts bother to pay attention. But going back to something that Emma said that I agree with, like we don't have a regulatory, like our Federal Election Commission no longer has a quorum, which means like, yes, I'm also worried about Russians interfering in our election, but that means that domestic actors that decide they want to do things that the FEC would find illegal, well, they can just do them, and the FEC won't, like, if it's a new thing, the FEC won't be able to rule it's illegal because the FEC commissioners can't meet. So I'm much more worried about the fact that we don't have a regulatory state, and we have one party that's like said on the record that they would like to structurally suppress the vote because Donald Trump has come out and said that if everybody votes, then Republicans won't win elections. The fact that one of our two parties has decided we would like fewer people to vote and we are going to engage in tactics to make votes not be counted worries me much more than data used for propaganda.
So I should have made this a 2-hour event minimum because we're only beginning to scratch the surface, and I wish that this could go on. We're nearing the end. I want to ask you a question that I've seen in the Q&A section that I think you could both be very helpful with, which is, all right, we already talked about the regulatory apparatus and what we can and can't do, and obviously we've only scratched the surface there. But most of the people, probably nearly all the people who are watching this webinar right now, don't work in as regulators. They are individual citizens trying to make good decisions and to be responsible members of civic society, right? What can an individual do in this under-regulated, hyper-datafied political environment in order to be an empowered and an ethical citizen, regardless of your underlying political beliefs?
Get out the vote. Honestly, I don't think this is in the realm of what people can do. Yes, I believe that, educating yourself about data privacy and, disinformation and, digital literacy, all these things are important. But honestly, I don't think this is in the realm of people's ability to choose how to navigate. I don't think we can protect ourselves completely. The online world has been designed around trying to trick us, essentially, and get us to respond in ways that are not necessarily in our interests. We can go a certain level up to trying to educate ourselves and to equip ourselves to navigate that environment. But really what we need to be doing is to be demanding a regulator for data, as well as licensing in the influence industry. I believe it's not just about Cambridge Analytica, as I'm sure you've probably picked up from Dave quite rightly. That's not to say they're not a problem still, and we don't need to know more. But this is a huge global problem that isn't just about America as well. And we need to have more transparency. We need to have more, understanding of how to respond to these kinds of companies. And unfortunately, nobody's really looking at this. They're all looking at how we can identify disinformation and take it down, which is maybe that comes some way towards addressing the problem. But you know what? It's not really going to be a long-term solution. We need to look at these companies that we've neglected for so long, that have been transforming an industry that's been building on billions of dollars over the last sort of 10, 15 years or so, and has really been operating, in such opaque ways internationally, mowing down people's rights. And, we need to take that seriously. And that's what I'm arguing for. We need to be really spreading the word on this and looking at ways we can pressure our representatives to take action against this issue. We need, especially, we need to be thinking about ways in which, campaigns are funded, and, making this kind of more transparent, end the dark money now. Okay.
So lobby our Congress people to reverse Citizens United and vote for people who will.
Yes.
Is your short
and
answer.
The
TLDR.
Disclose Act as well needs to be supported. Yeah.
The encryption.
Disclose Act.
The Disclose Act. Yeah.
What I would add is, yes, get out the vote. The solutions to these problems are not going to be found at the individual level. It is going to require regulators that start regulating again, and a government that takes governance seriously. We don't have those. We're going to need to get them. So that means, yes, do what you can on the national scale. Also, the deltas are larger at the local scale. So get involved in local politics, find a civic association that believes in what you believe in, and participate in that. But also understand you're signing up for the long term. Everything doesn't get fixed in November, no matter what happens. It's going to require an awful lot of time to repair. In terms of tech, again, we need regulators to start regulating again. We haven't had that for a long time. So once we have a regulatory regime, yes, I think something like the GDPR for the US would make sense. Yes, also we're going to need to break up these monopolies. If we want market incentives to play some role, and I think we want marketing incentives to play some role, then we need a functional market. And that means that when you decide I'm going to exit Facebook because I don't like the company, if the other thing you can go to is Instagram, that is Facebook, or WhatsApp, that is Facebook, that's a problem. That means that there's not competition. So yeah, we're also going to need to, I'm not saying shut down big tech, but break up the biggest of the tech monopolies, because monopoly is a problem. We know that. So magic wand, I'd like to do those two things. And on campaign finance, yes, I agree, but also to get campaign finance, we're going to need a radically different Supreme Court than we have. The number of problems that are the number of roadblocks that we're going to have to fixing campaign finance that has to be fixed are so many that sign up for a decade. It's not going to happen in a year.
Yeah. Also,
we need to do majorly move the needle on climate change in less than a decade. So we got a lot of problems. A lot of problems there.
Okay, well that's a good note to end things on. So I began today by saying I'm terrified, and we're ending with Dave Karp telling us that we got a lot of problems. So I'm not sure we've made any progress, but it has been entertaining, somewhat empowering, certainly informative. I appreciate so much of all the work that you, both of you, Dave and Emma, that you do as scholars and as citizens and as people. And thank you for spending an hour of your very busy day with all of us. And let's do this again.
Yes, let's. It was really wonderful. Thank you both, and really great. I really enjoyed this so much.
Wonderful. And really quickly, thank you to everybody at the Internet Governance Lab, at the Internet Society Washington, D.C. chapter, and at the School of Communication, especially Matt Seklecki, who managed this whole event. And feel free to follow up with any and all of us via email if your questions didn't get addressed. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.